Okay, so I thought we'd just all sit here and discuss a few things about the play. One, I was hoping that we could just chat briefly about what drew you guys to this particular play in general. Maybe we can start with Janice.
Actually, I think what drew me to the play is also what kind of made me scared about doing the role of the play, and that is really how real it is. I felt that I could relate to the role of Sharon almost too well. She resonated with me for many, many reasons, just in terms of, I'm a mother as well. I have children who are very close in age to Connor. I have many, many friends who have Connors in their lives. I've known many Sharons in my life. And the circumstances were so much a part of a fabric of what I've sort of heard about and experienced that I felt it was really important to tell the story. And at the same time, I was afraid I'd be swallowed up by it. So it was kind of an ambivalent response I had when I first looked at the script. But obviously it won me over in the end.
I'm glad to hear that. Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, actually, I didn't know what I was getting into when I auditioned for this.
It's always good to have one person like that.
He showed up for a different role, actually.
Yeah.
It was a mistake.
But once I found out what it was about, I knew it was something I had to do because just like Janice here, I do have experience, not personally, but secondhand with people who have depression, and I thought this would be a good way to learn about it and to understand it better, because I'd never really felt like I understood depression, and now since doing this I feel like I understand it a bit more. Not really though, because it's really hard to understand, but better than I did before.
Yeah.
I actually saw the Tarragon production when it premiered in Toronto 4 years ago roughly, and I remember it was just one of those shows that stuck with me. So when I heard Eastside was doing it, I jumped on the chance to audition for it because it's a show that always stuck with me. And again, it's so relevant right now that I think it's important to explore, and I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good segue. I saw the same production. That was my first encounter with the play, and I was immediately moved by it. And I think what actually really was interesting for me was that oftentimes when I go to see theater, I'm identifying with one character over another, but there's always one that sort of resonates a bit more. And with this play, I found it unbelievably interesting that I was finding elements of every single character that I was relating to in some way, and I think it was through all my own experiences. When I had seen it, I had just become a mother for the first time, so obviously identifying with Janie, and being a mother, obviously I was identifying with Sharon's character, but then I had also dated someone who was suffering from depression and was suicidal at the time, so that whole element of Connor and whatnot. And then I have several friends who are police officers and who talk about this kind of intersection of mental illness and law enforcement, and that's come up in discussions, and I just was so moved by it and so impacted by it, and like you, it stuck with me for a long time afterwards. And I just thought, wow, I would love to explore all the various levels of this play at some point. And when the opportunity to direct came up, I was like, I just had to do it, I think, for that. So
yeah, I think what was interesting about the story for me was getting a chance to attempt to get in the head of a police officer, especially in the last few years. They seem to be kind of public enemy number one in the media. You're always hearing about police officers shooting and beating people up, and I don't know, public perception of police officers is kind of tenuous right now. So it was interesting to try to explore the humanity behind the facade, behind the uniform.
Yeah.
For me, yeah.
Absolutely. What about the process, if anything, or once you got in and started delving into the play and into the characters and the relationships, was there anything about that ended up surprising you, or things that you discovered either about yourself or just about the character in general, or maybe life in general, that was sort of new or unexpected? Or
I think one thing that I really like about the play that you might not necessarily expect from it is how hopeful it is as a play. Despite it being heavy and emotional, I wouldn't describe it as tragic. which I really, really like. And I think it helps it to avoid some of the tropes of like romanticizing mental illness or falling into using it as like for shock value. And I think it really helps to explore it in a way that's very human, and it's nice to be part of that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually really intrigued once I got a copy of the script itself and started actually delving into it a little bit deeper. I was amazed, and of course even experiencing it, watching how much humor there is, and the humor always seemed to come right at the right moment when you just needed that little break. And I found when I was watching it, I was so grateful for those moments. And so as a director, that was really exciting to find those and explore those. And I mean, personally, I found Joan MacLeod's writing of that, the way she wove it together, just unbelievably affecting and incredible, really. Like I just find the story, how it was seamed together, was just phenomenal.
I mean, maybe I'll comment on that. You were asking about sort of the process and something that surprised us. And for me, it was the unconventional structure of the play was really a very interesting and intriguing way to work, because as we know, there's two parallel storylines here, and it's almost like you're watching two plays unfold before your eyes, and yet obviously they weave together. And the way our rehearsal process was, at least initially, we were rehearsing mostly in isolation with sort of our scene partners, and it felt kind of a bit disjointed. And then once we see it all come together, and all of the earlier references that suddenly make sense now when you realize, your character's being talked about in this whole other scene that's happening on stage in like a different play, but it's also about you. It was really fascinating to see it all woven together in really a very clever and expert way, but just in the right timing for, I think, the audience to kind of make those connections and kind of put the pieces together.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually found also directing it with you guys, you were so giving and open and ready to explore. It was really awesome, and often when I come in, I sort of have all these predetermined notions of how I'm going to do certain things and whatnot. And what I discovered certainly throughout the process was that I was discovering layers upon layers upon layers as we were exploring and evolving. So what I thought was just one thing and very sort of black and white was actually a whole bunch of other things that then would sort of come to the surface, and then that would become, let's explore that piece. So just as a director, in terms of process, that was exciting, because often I don't necessarily have that much discovery. I mean, after reading it, I'm kind of there and I'm in it and it makes sense, but there was a lot of discovery, even for me, and I know obviously for you guys throughout the process.
I think what was surprising is how relevant it still is. I mean, it's relevant, but the fact that there's still so much discussion and understanding that needs to happen with how police deal with people who have mental health issues.
And also how parents deal with people. It's not just the police that are confused and aren't understanding what's going on. Like, it happens at all levels of society.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, understanding the role of police officers and the toll the job takes on them and their mental health issues. I mean, you wouldn't send a police officer to go to work with a broken leg. Why would you send them in with a broken mind?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's not just one side of the coin, it's the other side as well. These are the people we are entrusting to police and serve the community, but they need to be looked after as well. Yeah. They need resources, they need to be able to talk about it, because I think in some ways it might still be a stigma. And also, it's such a macho profession.
And also, like, just the education, because I think at one point it talks about
2 hours of police
like just
work.
two hours of preparation to handle something that needs
a lot more
in-depth education about it. So a lot of things come from a place of ignorance and just lack of understanding, yeah,
like I wouldn't be expected to draw the Mona Lisa watching half an hour of Bob Ross,
Right.
I mean? It just wouldn't make sense. So that was the biggest surprise for me, just a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. And it was really interesting delving into the process too. I sort of, bits that I thought were going to be easy to explore, I discovered often were the more difficult pieces to explore, and then vice versa. Stuff that I was like, oh, that's going to be a real challenge. I was like, oh, that actually came. So there was just a lot about this play that wasn't exactly as it seemed right on the surface from the first take. Like there was just so much was evolving and changing, and also depending on where all the emotions were at any given time really changed and flavored things as we moved along. So so that was, it was just such an interesting exploration from beginning to end, and I feel like we're still exploring. So as we move into tech and whatnot, so yeah. Was there any major challenges that you guys felt, or what was your biggest challenge, you think, in terms of the character or your process?
Something I thought would be a challenge, but surprised me actually. So to answer both questions, the last one and this one, I thought not being, I've never really been depressed like I mentioned before, but I thought diving into Connor would be difficult because I wouldn't understand him, but actually I understand him more than most of my characters. I'm not sure what it is, but something about how when you do your research about depression and realize that you're not that, you can see it from afar, and I feel like I can really dissect it because I feel like I'm such a positive person. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Anyone else?
Well, you know, I am a psychologist in my day job, and so that was both, I think, a help and a hindrance for me. And even though I was certainly aware that it could be a hindrance to me, it's still very, very hard to unknow what you know. So because, of course, you know, I'm trained in mental health. I've seen mental health. I hopefully have a better understanding than maybe the average person about how to handle people dealing with some of the issues that Connor is. But I had to push all of that aside and really just be a mom who's very confused and trying her best, even though many of the things she's doing are absolutely not helping, and she's not really hearing her son. And so instinctively, that was very, very hard for me to get past, even though I knew I needed to. But it felt so wrong because I've been a psychologist longer than I've been a mom, frankly. It felt really wrong, and I had to really work through all of that and to allow sort of Sharon to be Sharon. And it also, though, really gave me a lot more insight into how much of a struggle it is for average people to understand mental health and to be the parent and watch your child making these decisions. And I have friends who are doing exactly these things, and it's very hard for me to watch that, but sort of have to allow them to kind of be, you know, the way that they need to be. Yeah. So it was very helpful for me also as a psychologist to sort of empathize with Sharon as a mother and to recognize that those mistakes that she's making are coming from a place of being a mother and sort of learning herself about what, you know, the difference between sadness and depression. Many people think about depression as, you know, a sad mood. And there's so much more that's anger, there's so much more that isn't sadness that is very hard to feel sympathetic about. Yeah. When somebody, I mean, the way Connor treats Sharon in this play is extremely hurtful. Yeah. And, you know, how are you supposed to feel sympathetic towards somebody who's being so nasty to you? Yeah. And yet really what's driving it is from a place of pain. Yeah. Absolutely. But that's just not obvious to so many people. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point.
Yeah. Just how much law enforcement has to compartmentalize on a daily basis just to get through the day. You know, they see a lot, they deal with a lot, people in various amounts of like stress or harm. I couldn't imagine. And you can't bring that home. It affects you, but you have to like put it aside and not bring that home. Yeah. But you can't really do that when you're asking these people to respond with empathy. That's and with compassion. Yeah. It's insanely difficult, and that puts you in such a strange space. So trying to explore this character, there were some days I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no clue. So yeah, it kind of shed some insight into what
Yeah.
police officers must have to deal with in a small way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you've also raised an interesting point, Sean, in terms of, society has a long way to go in understanding the first responders and all of that. And I think we've made a lot of progress around the military. We certainly now understand about PTSD and all of that as a legitimate disability. And we've just had the Invictus Games, which, everyone's really sort of on board with the idea that there are invisible wounds that people experience. But we have really not made much progress around the police force in that area. I mean, people have talked about paramedics and first responders from the helping side of things, but the police, I agree, there's still the negative connotation that in the media that has been portrayed for police, and I think we have to break through that before we can generate the same kind of understanding that we have for the military and for other first responders.
Yeah, to better equip them to do
Yeah,
to do their job. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, their jobs are very black and white seeming, and yet they're not. There's so many shades of gray. The world is that way, and I think cops are or police are expected to be a certain way, and yet also expected to have all these other levels and areas of expertise as well, but somehow it's not acknowledged. And so
almost like you had mentioned at one point in rehearsal,
really,
like a social worker. Almost.
Yeah, it's like
Just with a gun.
That's right. It's like a social worker with a gun. That's
Like
the
in Sweden
expectation.
or Iceland.
Yeah, or
Right.
Iceland. That's the expectation, and yet that's not how they're trained, is my understanding. So they're trained for very, very black and white protocol follow, and they have to some degree, obviously, but then there's this expectation that isn't provided. And so that's where I think it gets really muddy, and we still have a long way to go as a society in terms of bridging that gap. So.
And I think there's so much judging that's hindsight, right? Where the public,
course.
from the comfort of their homes, watching videotapes, people's cell phones of what's happening on TV, it's so different than being there. I
Yeah.
mean, when
Yeah.
the truth comes out afterwards, it's easy to judge. But in the moment, you don't know.
No,
Right? You
yeah.
don't know what you're dealing
Yeah.
with and whether that rolled up piece of paper isn't
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Anything else to add? Okay, well, I want to thank you guys for sitting down and chatting with me about this. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll end there.